It is 5 p.m. West African time. Welcome to One Slot. I'm your host, Felicity Ezewuike. Now, the Republic of Somaliland, a self-declared independent country in the Horn of Africa over the past 3 decades, has made huge strides in maintaining peace and holding elections. This has earned it some attention and praise from foreign governments and policymakers, but not yet recognized as a sovereign nation. Somalia continues to reject Somaliland's independence claims declared in 1991. It is important to mention that Somaliland was a distinct region from Somalia in the late 1800s. It was a British protectorate until 1960. It became independent for just 5 days before merging with Somalia. Those in favor of Somaliland's claim to independence point to it having its own currency, military, issuing its own passports, and holding its own elections. They also say it is more stable than Somalia and has seen little terrorist activity since 2008. Then again, although it is a relatively stable region, but according to World Bank, it is the 4th poorest country in the world. This tag is not slowing the leaders down. Mid-last month, Somaliland's president appealed to the international community to recognize the territory's independence after admitting that negotiations with Somalia has failed. But of what good are his efforts towards international recognition when all overtures to encourage dialogue by external parties since 2012 seem to produce no tangible result? The most recent engagement in 2020 only came up with the appointment of technical committees to continue discussions. No meetings has taken place to my knowledge till date. How important is it that channels for dialogue remains open? On One Slot today, I have Yusuf Kajura. He is recently just finishing his PhD in social studies. Thank you very much for joining with us on One Slot.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's been plenty of questions about Somaliland and Somalia. There are also plenty territories across Africa seeking independence. But people say Somaliland is a little different. It was an independent nation once, like I mentioned in my intro, for a grand total of 5 days between its independence from Britain and its merger with Somalia. I want you to tell us a bit more about that so we can establish a premise for the conversation.
Yeah, it's not different. In fact, there are a couple of other countries which are actually like Somaliland. But the case of Somaliland was independent for 5 days. But in arguing for independence with the colonial government, independence had to be hastened because they wanted to unite with Somalia, which had been colonized by the Italians. And the argument then was that, we are the same people. The Somalis in the Somali Peninsula are the same. We are united by language, culture, religion. So we should come together as one country. Colonialism had thrown the different Somali people into different territories. So there was an argument for Somali Nimo, which is the term for Somali nationalism. It was a unique case on the African continent because, you would claim homogeneity of the peoples, right? Homogeneous at the level of language, culture, and religion. And so there was an argument that, the people who had been thrown into Kenya, the Northern Frontier District, the people that had been put under Ethiopia in the Ogaden region, Djibouti in the extreme north of the continent, and then Somalia and Somaliland would come together and form the Greater Somali Republic. That was the contention. And the intelligentsia of that time argued quite convincingly that they should unite. So Somalia and Somaliland provided the beginning, the first to come together. And then the idea was that after these two are formed union, there will be agitation to have all these other communities, Somali communities, come together and form one bigger Somali Republic.
Okay. Unlike other aspiring nations, the country it is technically part of has no official presence I mean, in Somaliland now. The place functions as an independent country, even though it is remained unrecognized by international communities for over 20 years. What are the issues stopping her independence?
Yeah, the issues are not to do with Somaliland itself. The issues are to do with the continent. You know, the African continent has so many latent and manifest secessionist movements. So you have secessionist movements across the African continent. Some are very pronounced in DRC, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Nigeria and Cameroon. There's a region wants to break away. There are all these secessionist movements across the continent. So the contention by the African Union is they don't want to open up Pandora's box, where one country breaks away and all the others start clamoring for secession. So this is the kind of contention they have against Somaliland. So they can't unilaterally declare it another independent African state. And the AU has this sort of requirement that the mother country, you can call it the mother country, has to first of all accept the secession of the country which is seeking secession, right? So, and as of now, Somalia, southern Somalia, is unwilling to accept any other country breaking away from it, which would come by way of organizing a referendum in the northeastern part of the country. Somalia is unwilling to do that for easy reasons. For example, there's no stable government in Mogadishu to organize a referendum for the northeastern part to break away, right? But at the same time, they're still caught out, and there's a push and pull between these two countries. So Somalia, for its own interests, has refused to organize a referendum, is unwilling, clearly, to say we should let Somaliland go. But no country would be willing to do that, right? You don't expect any African country, any country under any claim of stable leadership to say, we're organizing a referendum for another country to break out from us, right? It's not usual that you see things like that happen. It's often a product of so many other circumstances. So it is those two reasons: the AU, the arrangement of the AU itself, the fears within the politicians within the AU, and then Somalia itself, which is Mogadishu, where the capital is. They are unwilling for reasons that are clear, such as the failure to organize themselves in Mogadishu, but also being unwilling to let go in a region which is part of them. Even when
I get what you're saying, but let's remember when we started, I asked different territories are coming up to say that they want their independence, irrespective of the reality of the, for lack of a better word, the mother country that they want to break away from. So does that illegitimize their quest for independence from Somalia? How, if Somalia is having its own issues, should it mean that the people of Somaliland should rest and just allow them sort their issues, not knowing when that will come to an end?
You know, at the end of colonization, there was agreement among the African countries that, I think that was OAU then, not to dismantle the colonial borders, right? In the borders in which an African country got independence, there was agreement never to destabilize those borders, right? So the first argument working against any country seeking secession is that, you know, we don't want to destabilize these borders. And as I said earlier, almost every country on the African continent has either a visible, invisible, manifest, or sort of dormant secessionist project. You need to just look at the continent everywhere. You know, even a country as small as Rwanda, a country as small as Burundi has like voices seeking secession. So the politicians don't want to open the Pandora's box. The AU doesn't want to open this window that you can actually disagree with a mother government and you can declare secession, right? So they don't want to open that. So the first reason is not the ways in which Somaliland is run. It's a region which is internal to the entire African continent. Then secondly, it's the arrangement with the AU that the mother country has to agree to secession, right? So whether what you're doing is right or wrong, the mother country has to agree. I'm using mother very problematically it has to agree that now we are letting you go and we need to organize a referendum, which is often simply procedural, and then independence is granted. So before those processes are concluded, whatever happens within Somaliland is difficult to allow them succeed.
Okay, but despite all of these challenges, the instability in Somalia, there's been a series of talks. I mean, the most recent was in 2020. If, from what I'm getting from you, Somalia is not going to let go, what is the point of the continuing talks?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They've actually been voices in Hargeisa. Hargeisa is the capital of Somaliland. That these talks are meaningless, right? These talks are meaningless. But there are voices in Somalia which argue that we need to continue engaging the mother country so that they see our point of view. It is while Somalia pushes the position that we need to unite as we were before, Somaliland pushes the position we are not united. We want to go separate ways. And these talks have continued, taking different formats. The solid opinion in Hargeisa is that we need to continue engaging in this conversation so that we portray ourselves as civil and well-intentioned people, pushing our position or breaking away. I've lived in Somaliland, I've done field work in Somaliland. I don't see a politician who would ever say we're uniting with Somalia again. It's difficult to fathom. I can't imagine that happening at the level where we are 30 years down the road. I don't see that happening. So the talks matter to a degree that you need to continuously engage as you push these different positions, right? You don't want to appear so hardline with your position that there's total breakdown of conversations, right? And as you realize, these are the same people. To a degree, there are differences, but they speak the same language, religion, and culture. Many things are sort of, they are homogeneous in that arrangement. And beyond the political stalemate, the people in these two places continue their conversation. You know, weddings are, people meet in Mogadishu and they marry in Hargeisa, right? Artists travel from Hargeisa to Mogadishu and stage concerts. So the conversation at the level of people is ongoing. So you don't want to kill that by undergoing a hardline political stalemate. So, you know, for that, these conversations have to continue happening. So there's value in them, even when the positions seem to be extreme.
Okay, what are the risks? You've talked about the importance of allowing these conversations to continue, but what are the risks of it stopping if there is a seeming fatigue on both sides, knowing that, I mean, these people are not going to give? We'll talk about the international engagement and get your perspective on it, and as well as how countries like Eritrea and South Sudan were able to get their independence away from their mother country, original place of birth. What are the risks of not continuing the conversation, and maybe that fatigue begins to get to people and they sit back and say, let's just stay in Somalia? Do you see the possibility of that? If not, what are the risks of not continuing the talks?
I don't see fatigue on the part of the hardcore and the mainstream politicians. It's not like engaging in war. This is diplomacy. Diplomacy, you can't get fatigued in engagement. So, and you got to understand that a secessionist movement is a political project. Political projects have to engage till they deliver their goods, right? The actors may keep changing, but the ambition and willingness to continuously engage is always there, right? Especially when you consider the ways in which the African Union is organized. Okay, the ways in which the African Union is organized is that the mother country has to endorse the divorce. So, being the case, the actors continuously change, but the conversation has to continue. It's a campaign which I don't see fatigue, especially on the side of Somaliland, right? They're very interested in this project. But as you need to be aware that as they continue to engage, they've made major advances as a country, right? Now they have major projects happening in the extreme end with Berbera Port, where the government in Dubai is invested in building a world-class port, right? So this is ongoing, and they've continued to organize what you can actually call democratic elections. They've continued to work on peace. So the ways in which they're portraying themselves, the ways in which Somaliland portrays itself as an internationalist, as a democratic and progressive entity, there's no way they're going to step back from the talks, because that will, sort of portray them in a different light.
Yes. Well, one of some would say one of the gains of, one of the efforts would be the establishment of diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Do you agree with that? If yes, what is the point of having a diplomatic relationship between two unrecognized republics that are seeking independence?
Oh no, they don't just have them with Taiwan. They have them with the region in the north, which is contesting with Morocco. I forget. Southern Sahel. It's Sahel. There's a well-known secessionist movement there. But they've established relations with many other countries, right? They've got diplomatic relations with many other countries, including the UK. They have an embassy in Kampala, sort of a functional unit, which you can call an embassy. They have diplomatic relations with the UK. The former colonizer is seen in very benevolent terms. They have many. They've tried as much as possibly could to establish diplomatic relations with many countries, and many of those countries have actually given them a degree of legitimacy. I don't know what level, but there's a degree of legitimacy that they recognize them being in that country as a separate, independent that you can work with, right? You need to remember that this is the Horn of Africa, right? This is the Horn of Africa, the tip of the Horn of Africa, and that's a region. On this side, you have Somalia. On the other hand, you have Yemen, and that region, the Gulf of Aden, is a space of enormous economic potential, right? There's so much traffic going there, connecting the regions. So any civilized Western power, any other country in the world which has economic interest in that region is happy to work with any stable unit. And Somaliland has portrayed itself over the years as very stable and ready to work with anybody, right? So it's not just Taiwan. It's many countries in Europe and on the African continent.
The stability you refer to is debatable. Hopefully, in the course of this conversation, we'll look at that and how it impacts on their quest for independence. But let's look at the comments by...
Somaliland is very stable.
Somaliland, there are arguments that there is almost, let me not exaggerate, 80% of the people are illiterate. That's what they say. They don't have, let's not fast track the conversation. Let's see if we can get step by step to get to that point. And you will have your say on it. But I want us to speak quickly on the comments by the president of Somaliland, who says he does not see any future in the continuation of dialogue with Somalia. And then he's looking for a partnership, a recognition from international community, so to speak. And then I think comments that he made reference the fact that the situation with Somaliland and Somalia can only be settled by Africa and not the international community. First off, do you align with that way of thinking? And is it true that Africa is more responsible for encouraging Somalia to let Somaliland become independent? Let's hear that first, and then we'll continue. I hope I was able to make sense with the question.
Yeah, first of all, the comments by President Musa Bihi to say that you were wasting time talking to Somalia, that's a sentiment in Hargeisa. You find that sentiment in the capital, you find it in the press, you find it in many spaces. People argue because they are pushing. Southern Somalia is pushing for union, and clearly in Hargeisa, the most popular voice is for independence. So when that's the point that you made earlier about sort of political fatigue on part of the negotiators. But that has been said for the last maybe 20 years, right? The idea that we should abandon these talks and while at the same time going back to the talks, has been constant, right? It's a way of putting pressure on any of the major actors so that they can see a way out of this conundrum, right? So often Somaliland is in the position of threatening to abandon the talks because of the position that Somalia is pushing, but they often go back to the talks. And I want to see that as the politics of this campaign, right? That you have to continuously engage, but also push in different fronts. You threaten abandoning the talks completely, and then different actors will come in and say, I mean, these talks are in Nairobi, in Djibouti, in many different places in Kenya, so that, there's a breakthrough. So when Musa Behi says, we're wasting time, it's understandable. It's coming from a position where, you need to exert more pressure on any of those that are willing to contribute to your political project. But then when you ask the question whether the African continent, the AU especially, is bent on keeping the country together, that is the spirit of the African Union. The African Union should ideally keep countries together. It shouldn't support these countries disintegrating, because there are many of these countries with these projects, right? But when Musa Behi starts to appeal to the international community, he has picked examples from elsewhere. I can guarantee you there was no way South Sudan was going to break out from Sudan if it wasn't for the Americans, right? It was the Americans exerting pressure onto al-Bashir, portraying him as a terrorist and as a support of terrorism, as Muslim extremist.
If I may interject, we really need to go on a break, but if I may interject quickly, if you reference the fact that America played a key role in getting South Sudan its independence, what does that say about African Union should not only be about keeping status quo, it should also be about allowing people the independence that they desire if they wish to thrive, right?
Well, I don't know how much trust you have in the African Union, right? You got to understand that the African Union is, I don't know how to describe it, right? There's little hope in many of the players in there. They don't trust the African Union too much. The African Union is very unprogressive. You don't see them pushing positions that are meant to benefit the continent, right? They have all these clauses in their acts, which don't allow them. Because every major player in the African continent, I mean, Uganda has a president who's been powerful for 35 years. Many other players have presidents who are stealing elections every single day. They have similar grievances like Somalia has. Even Somalia has had war for longer than many of these other countries, but they have similar grievances, right? So this is the core of the AU, equally conflicted people running this organization. You don't have like an independent political entity based on research and democratic values running the African Union, right? It's headed by all these different heads, right? I mean, the guys who are in Congo fomenting the war, one day they could be the leaders of the AU. It's as conflicted as you can imagine, right? Mm-hmm. So that being the way you should see the AU, Musa Behi is not blind to this reality. He's aware that as you push the AU to act, you got to be willing to push the people with actual power.
Okay, I want you to just hold on to that thought. We'll come back and explore it. And I saw your frown when I mentioned the fact that there are certain indices that say question its preparedness for independence. I was waiting for the later part of the conversation, but we're going to take that on after this break. And then in the last part of it, we will hopefully look at the ways and the options that are available for Somaliland to see an end to their quest. Join us again. Good to know you're still with us. I still have my guest, Yusuf Kajuru, speaking to us on the stalemate between Somaliland and Somalia. Yusuf, before we get on the subject of Somaliland's preparedness for independence in real terms, I want us to explore a little more the role of the African Union, basically. They say they have yet to give formal recognition, and you also acknowledge that it will encourage other secessionist groups and embolden them a little more. So Somalia is working to stop Somaliland's Somaliland's efforts to get international recognition while they are pursuing it. In all of this, what would be an ideal response from African Union that will show a more united, instead of the seeming quiet, the seeming silence that we hear, we perceive at the moment? We send a strong message that they are either in support or against the request for independence.
If the African Union were a group that is up to the job of seeing a prosperous African continent, maybe you would argue they would send a fact-finding mission to Somaliland and find out if there's and test the sentiments, the preparedness. I'm very comfortable with the idea of preparedness, but just test the sentiments and do research and find out what is really going on. And also at the same time, send a fact-finding mission to Somalia in Mogadishu and find out. Because Somaliland, if you look at Somalia, the mother country, it's very unstable. Like a huge part of the country is controlled by Al-Shabaab. The government only controls in Mogadishu. It's only stable because there's a peacekeeping mission. There's a UPDF is in country, AMISOM is there. That's the only reason Somalia, Mogadishu has seen some sense of stability. The biggest part of the country, the government in Somalia has no control over them, right? The government in Mogadishu. So if the government in Mogadishu has no control over the biggest parts of the south, it will be difficult for you to argue, 30 years down the road, that this same government, you wanted to, start issuing directives and being, say, into a federal republic with Somaliland being a federal state, right? That's a difficult position. You need to do research. You need to ask people who are studying these regions if the AU was up to the job, right? They're not doing this. They're still pushing for electoral reforms in Mogadishu. Mogadishu should be pushing stability. There should be ways of talking to Al-Shabaab so that you see stability in southern Somalia, right? So the AU is obsessed with pushing democracy in a dysfunctional space, right? I can tell you that, Al-Shabaab collects taxes in Mogadishu, right? The central government in Mogadishu doesn't control over the city. The capital city is controlled by Al-Shabaab, technically. They collect taxes, which you can call ransom. They settle disputes. When you have a major dispute in Mogadishu over, say, your property, you're better off working with Al-Shabaab than working with the central government, right? Yeah. And so it's in this space that, the African Union, with their like international allies, they're still pushing for democracy. How do you have an election in such a space? This is a country we need to sit together in the spirit of Har. The Somalis have the moral commonwealth called Har. Sit together, talk to Al-Shabaab. This is not a secular space. As Somalia is 100% Muslim, they need to have Islam as part of their integral, growth, right? But we're still caught up in the talk of the war on terror. So anything Islamic can't operate in a space such as Somalia. You don't allow a homegrown a solution such as having Islamic religion as part of the ways in which Mogadishu is organized, right? Yet, when you look at Somalia, on the other hand, this is the way they are run. Somaliland is the way they are run. They have the cultural leaders, they have Islam, they pursue a strong Islamic identity. In this house, they've been able to have stability for all these years, right? So the AU is pushing a project Mogadishu with neither head nor tail. Right? So the AU should start by having a thorough, homegrown look at Mogadishu. You see, so this
homegrown. I think that's the word. That's the key word. Having a homegrown look as to how democracy really should grow in Africa, other than, like you said, trying to hold on, paraphrasing now, old structures that may not be functioning properly. While you were talking, I was thinking of something that I read, and it's basically about the fact that Somalia is in chaos. Somaliland seems to have some semblance of calm, but there is still no peace across board. No matter how you look at it, that's the position. From what I have seen, that's some of the positions that's been taken. What's your reaction to comments, or should I now say conspiracy theories, that there are parties, international parties, who are benefiting from allowing the situation to remain the way it is, and then to some degree exacerbating the conflict in Somalia?
It's not conspiracy theory. There have been studies which have been done. When you look at piracy in the Horn of Africa, the major pirates are international pirates, right? They're marine pirates, international, Norwegian, Chinese, British ships which are stealing Somali's marine resources. The major pirates in the region are not Somalis. Somalis, these are like local boys trying to safeguard their territory. Trying to collect, say we should collect taxes from these ships which are doing these routes, paying taxes to nobody basically. So it's not a conspiracy theory. There's been studies on that.
Okay.
The major destabilizers of peace in the region. I don't really. I mean, when you go back to 2006, for example, when the Union of Islamic Courts organized Mogadishu, the first thing they did was cleaning the city, right? The city is very dirty. So the first thing they did was cleaning the city.
If I may interject, it might seem like a naive question, but if there's been studies and we know that there is some conspiracy to keep the situation as it were, why is it that African leaders are not being a little more proactive in trying to, yes, there is a risk that if you allow every group that says that they want independence to get their independence, it might encourage, unsavory elements to take that up. But when people, like you clearly believe Somalilanders have a right to independence, shouldn't they act to give that independence, to discourage this international influence you keep hearing about?
Okay, I didn't say Somaliland has the right. That's not my position.
Okay. What is your position then? Let's establish that.
I want to answer the very first question about African leaders being proactive, right? We entered an era of sycophancy. We don't have African.
No, but I'd like to know your position on Somaliland's quest for independence, because that will inform, probably color what your reaction would be to the response and the kind of leadership that is required from Africa.
Let me first answer the question about the African leaders not being proactive.
Okay.
We are in the era of sycophancy, right? Many of our leaders have turned into colonial emissaries to the degree, the colonial compradors. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of neoliberal politics, the neoliberal order, the privatization coming to the African continent through a mixture of violence by our former colonizers coming back interested in taking our resources, using either violence and corruption. They bought off many of our leaders. Many of our leaders started paying lip service to actual ideas of having policies that develop their people. Right? Many of our leaders are into absolute sycophancy. They've decided to stay in power because they have given our entire economies to our former colonizers. This is the work of the World Bank and IMF, and our leaders are playing along because they love being in power. They are happy with their small dreams and small pleasures. They have these peanuts which come to them as bribes. They have power. They wear nice suits and can marry so many women, and they can be flown to Europe for medical attention. So our leaders are content with that. So the era we are in now is a little of is an era of sycophantic leadership across the African continent. There are no men who are willing to stand up. You remember a guy who was heavily blackmailed, Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe took the idea of African independence to the core. He questioned the supremacy of the World Bank and IMF on the African continent. And this is what happened. He was blackmailed for the entire time he was president, till he died. Gaddafi was taken out. So the type of leaders we have right now are absolute sycophants. They are opportunists, happy with their small. You see the stories in West Africa. These West African economies are still, having their monies given to the French central bank. They're not standing up because
okay. Well, one of the purpose.
Let me finish this. I want to build a case for this. So in that context, with the quality of leadership we have, in that context, you don't see leaders who are going to stand up for Somalia. No, nobody's going to stand up for Somali's marine resources as part of the AU. No, I mean, we look at the UPDF. The Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, is in Somalia as a mercenary force, right? Not really interested in keeping the peace and bringing back order to the country, but as a mercenary force. You see, so if this is the quality of leadership we have on the African continent, don't expect them to be proactive and think about...
You actually paint a very scary picture, a really scary one, because what hope is there for those who courageously continue to push for independence because they believe that is the only way they can be free. But let's try and see if we can because the purpose of one slot is to look for solutions, African solution of ideas on how we can be better and grow democracies across Africa. To reference, I still remember the question I asked you about, is Somaliland truly ready? Before we talk about how they can get the independence that they require, that they are asking for, how ready are they? And remember when I said earlier that there are a World Bank position is that they are the fourth, if they were an independent country, they were the fourth poorest in the world. There's also the issue I mentioned earlier. I said about 80%, I think that was an exaggeration, about half of the population is said to be illiterate. They also say that little food is grown in the country and most of it is imported from Ethiopia and the UAE. And of course, let's not talk about the very scary issue of female genital mutilation that is still being practiced, according to recent reports, in Somaliland. So again, to the question, for people that are strongly looking for independence, are they ready?
The question of readiness is a very problematic question, right? It's theoretically a difficult question. I don't know what you mean by readiness. What is the readiness for? We got independence in the 1960s. How ready were we? There was not a question. Why would a country seeking to be independent from another country be put on a readiness test? I don't understand. My sense is that the idea of independence is dependent on other reasons, and readiness is not one of them, right? I mean, you say it's the fourth poorest. I can imagine the poorest of the poor is an independent country.
Yeah, right? I don't have that data, but I do know that it's from the world.
The poorest of the poor is an independent country. It's not one of those seeking secession. Anyways, the question of readiness is a problematic question. It's not a political question, right? It's a technical question which will take you into some technicalities which are difficult to get out from. The reason as to why Somalia is not independent are purely political. It has to be the ways in which the AU is organized, the politics in Somalia, the international community. This has nothing to do with readiness. I can challenge you.
Okay. No, the question is to get the best response from you.
1 minute.
Go ahead.
If I ask you, how was South Sudan ready for independence? Because right after independence, plunged into conflict. Who took the readiness test to award South Sudan independence, right? So it's a very problematic question. And the things that you mentioned about being poor, FGM, these problems are everywhere on the African continent, independent or not independent. So these are problems we need to deal with.
The point of the question is to elicit and educate whoever is watching this program on some of the issues that are being raised and why maybe they're not valid enough. Like you said, who put out a test for readiness for any country that wishes to get independence? On the flip side, again, so when you look at one side of it, you look at the other side. And Freedom House, in the latest 2022 report, rated Somalia as, let me just read it how I wrote it, as not free, with a score of 7 out of 100. That's the 12th worst ranking in the world, according to Freedom House. What would be your response to those who say they find it a strange notion that because Somaliland, you just answered it now, has shortcomings, it should be forced to remain in Somalia? They argue that if Somaliland's inefficiencies disqualified from independence, then Somalia has much less a case of nationhood. So if you're destroying one part of the African land, you should do same to the other. What befits the right hand should also go to the left.
I mean, it baffles me that you're citing Random House. You know, in discussing the African continent, you're either with the colonizer or you're with the people. And you know, it baffles me.
No, could you take that again? You said if it's in conversations like this?
You're either with the colonizer or with the people. You know, it baffles me that, you know, Somalia, Mogadishu, is a clear case of a failed state. It's been said many times, it's a failed state. So how do you go ahead and rank a failed state? What studies did they do to rank a failed state, where like 70% of it is controlled by a terrorist organization? How do they come up with these figures, right? It's the time we started questioning. You know, in Somaliland, they've not even done a population census to know how many people they have. They have estimates. So where did Freedom House or whichever house come up with the figures that even the country itself doesn't have?
But that's the literature that's available. When you look at the situation in Somaliland and Somalia, you see literature, you see people making positions and giving out data. So whose duty is it to correct things?
Let me say, the problem here is that we tend to debate African countries using indices that don't resonate with our reality.
But for us to have a productive conversation, we need data. We need information.
I don't disagree, but we got to look, and this is the point I said earlier, that you either with the colonizer or with the people.
So right? how do we have intelligent conversations if we don't produce the data that we need? You said it yourself that Somalia is a failed state. If another person who is not an invested party is able to do research and provide data for us to use, I mean, they will continue to control the narrative.
But, you know, when I say it's a failed state, that's a political position. It's not a data, it's not a numerical position that you're ranking against GDP, against this and that. It's a political position. They don't have a government, they don't have this working, this not working, it's not working. That's sort of an anthropologist speaking, right? It's an anthropological position. And the data I'm using there is anthropological. It's not by, it's statistics and figures and percentages, right? But let me say this. We need to define the African episteme, right? We need to define the African episteme. What is the yardstick against which we judge the prosperity of a country, the ways in which a country is functioning? Do we use GDP with those problems, which is defined elsewhere? Do you know the way we're pushing democracy on the African continent? I've argued elsewhere that democracy, the ways in which we're divided and ruled, right? You saw the violence with which structural adjustment was pushed on the African continent. And with structural adjustment came the democracy merchandisers, right? I don't understand that, as African intelligentsia, we debate Central African Republic against the yardstick of democracy. Central African Republic, we debate Somalia on the yardstick of democracy. We are so disconnected from the African context. I've been insisting on stability, that if you are honest to think about Somalia, you'll be speaking the language of stability, not democracy. So when you bring a democracy yardstick to measure Somalia, you'll be at the bottom.
Okay, we're time constrained. So we're time constrained. What should we be talking about when we're talking about Somaliland and Somalia? What should be the conversation that we should be putting in the front burner? Because you're talking about us having our own, don't speak from those that are colonized and speak for the people.
Yeah, I've been in Mogadishu, I've been to Somalia quite plenty of times, and I'm very fascinated by the people in Somaliland have been able to do, right? And somebody has to be honest and fair to what they are doing, right? As an African, somebody who lives in East Africa, you got to be fair to what the people in Somaliland have managed to do, right? They've got lots of differences amongst themselves, but they've been able to sort of suspend their differences, work on them endlessly, and build something that works for them. With all their poverty and all the problems they have, such as FGM, they've been able to build something that works. You can say for the last 30 years, they've been building, right? You may disagree what they've done, you may disagree, you may call it an Isaac project, but they've been able to build something that works for them. They've been able to integrate religion into their politics. tradition. So they have two houses, the House of Elders, which are based on clans, and the House of and the representatives, which is politically, underwent a democratic process and they were voted into office, right? So they've been able to integrate these different strands of their society into governing themselves, right? In fact, at some extreme argument, you would say Somalia has to pick lessons from Somaliland, right? You could actually say that. At the risk of sound like a Somaliland activist who is very fascinated because got many friends and spent so much time in Hargeisa. At the risk of sounding like that, as an African, you don't want, and also at risk of seeking to divide the continent further. I wouldn't be for that, but it's very persuasive what they've been able to do over this period, right? You could argue that maybe Mogadishu has to be able to do the same. But Somalia is so conflicted by so many international players in that place. The interest by the international community in Somalia makes it difficult for Somalia to build a homegrown response to the challenge they face, right? So that leaves us in a sort of a mess at the moment. And I'm very comfortable arguing for continuous breaking of the African continent because divided before.
Okay.
But,
I'm looking at
picture I can broadly paint. Right, I can paint a picture like that. There's no you can't easily get out of this mess.
Okay, in the interest of time, I keep bringing up time because I really want you to speak on this. I mentioned earlier that Eritrea split from Ethiopia, and we also had the case of South Sudan and other African countries, right? They did this somehow successfully. Is there anything that Somaliland can learn from how they got theirs? Is there any realistic chance that Somaliland might enjoy the success that's been enjoyed by some other African countries that have been able to get their independence? I mean, you say it's a difficult one, but I mean, we have to try somehow.
You gotta appreciate that we're still a colonized continent, right? That's the beginning point. We're still
that's debatable. That's debatable.
Well, it's my position. I think we're still colonized, and South Sudan was able to have what you call success, because the empire granted a cession, right? Granted their claim for independence, turned all the narratives we know upside down, and supported their quest for independence. And they got it. And as soon as they got it, they entered into another war, right? And after that, you can't imagine the amount of pillage in South Sudan by those who sort of pretended over their independence. The amount of pillage is humongous. We have war in DRC, and if you're keen enough, the amount of pillage. The war continues in the Democratic Republic of Congo because, we're still a colonized continent. So it's difficult for me to say Somaliland can borrow lessons from South Sudan, right? Not too long ago, actually, they benefited from the conflict within the Middle East, where many countries ganged up against Qatar. And because Somalia refused to join the gang against Qatar, and Somaliland opportunistically joined the gang against Qatar, they benefited in a great way. Right now, the port in Berbera is a product of that conflict. I just think it's gonna be a waiting game for some geopolitical things to happen elsewhere from which they're going to benefit, just the way they're benefiting from the construction of the port in Berbera, right? So it's going to be a question of positioning and luck, right? And those are the positions for still colonized countries. We don't have the power. You need to speak about the AU. It's very weak and meek. When you speak about Somaliland itself, so is South Sudan. You can't say, they did something outstanding to get their independence. They're really beneficiaries of geopolitical contestations elsewhere, right? So
before I get you, I'll just say, after you respond to this, you'll give your final thoughts on the subject, because I'm told we're out of time. Presidential elections are expected to be held in Somaliland by November this year. I mean, anything about independence is probably put on hold for now in conversations. What would you suggest should be on the agenda of any government? Do you expect this president to take up another term? Do you see another a government coming in, and what approach should they take to their quest for independence? If you can say that in, say, 2 minutes, let's extend it, and then we wrap up.
Yeah. I was observing the election in 2018 with my friends Oki Indebe and Neo Shundere. We had a wonderful time in Somaliland observing the election. Internally, when the elections are happening, the question of independence is not one of them, right? You can't win an election on the promise that you'll earn Somaliland independent, because it's not a contested position. It seems like everybody in Hargeisa, which is Hargeisa and Burao, there are a couple of, but let's be clear, there are a couple of oppositional voices which are anti-secession in Somaliland, quite a number, but it's not one of those things that can win an election, right? Because that's already settled. Like, we want independence, so you don't have to promise us that, so that we can give you our votes. Okay. So it's never on the table. I've never had it as one of the rallying cries.
Okay.
It's a given. We want this. So when you get into office, we know it's one of the things you're going to be working on. Okay, so don't promise us anything, you know. And the people in Hargeisa are aware that it's not a small fight. They know how big it is. So you can't start saying, I'm going to deliver this, I'm delivering this. So it's
okay. Please just your final thoughts on the subject so we can wrap up. I think we have the news in another 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me for this show.
And thank you so much for your comments and your views. They've been really, really insightful. Thank you for speaking with us.
Welcome. Thank you too.
Right. In closing, I'll just basically quote something from Umar Mohammed and Zakaria Yusuf. They put it in a Crisis Group article. Ultimately, achieving progress in Somalia-Somaliland talks will require a commitment from both parties and the international community to address the difficult status issues that have eluded resolution to date. My guest actually said it's a very dicey one. Until the time is ripe for those discussions, however, the parties should not give up. Their external partners should all manage expectations, work through the technical issues that are in front of them, and keep talking. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.